Well, outside of that debate between those who say the press is too adversarial and must be curbed, and those who say, well, yes, the press is cantankerous and impossible, but we just have to suffer that in the interest of freedom. Outside the spectrum of that debate, which constitutes virtually the entire mainstream discussion, virtually the entire discussion, but outside the debate, there is another position. The other position challenges the factual assumption that's taken for granted in the debate. According to this alternative view, the media do indeed fulfill a societal purpose, but a very different one. Their societal purpose is to inculcate and defend the economic and social and political agenda of the privileged groups that dominate the domestic society. And they do this in all sorts of ways. They do it by selection of topics, by distribution of concern, by the way they frame issues, by filtering of information, by emphasis and tone, by simple fabrication sometimes, but crucially by the bounding of debate to make sure that it doesn't go outside of certain limits. The bounding both in the news columns and in the opinion columns, because of course the news columns themselves embody all sorts of assumptions and ideological presuppositions and so on. According to this alternative view, to the extent that there is a liberal bias, it serves primarily to bound thinkable thought, that is, to instill the unchallengeable assumptions, which in fact reflect this rather narrow elite consensus. So the liberal bias performs a real function. It says, thus far and no further. I'm as far as you can go, and I go as far, how far I go is still accepting the basic presuppositions as unchallengeable. Now, within those bounds, there's ample controversy, and it reflects the tactical divisions among elites over how to achieve generally shared aims, but these limits are very rarely transcended. So the media thus function in accordance with what my co-author Edward Herman and I have called a propaganda model in a recent book. That's another view. Well, the propaganda model has a lot of predictions. It has a lot of predictions about how the press is going to behave, but it also has a further prediction. The further prediction is that no matter how well confirmed the propaganda model is, it cannot be taken seriously, and therefore must be effectively excluded from mainstream discussion. And that actually follows from the model itself. The reason is that the model, if you think it through, the model rejects certain principles that are serviceable to power. That is, it falls outside the spectrum defined by the presupposition that the media are adversarial and cantankerous, perhaps excessively so. Now that presupposition is a useful one. It's serviceable to the interests of established institutions to believe that what you're reading is actually criticism if it's in fact support. That's a technique, it's a sophisticated technique of indoctrination. And of course it's very serviceable to the media themselves. It's nice to think that you're, pride yourself on being an independent and courageous adversary of power. And since those assumptions are serviceable, they're going to be upheld according to the propaganda model, and no serious challenge will be permitted. So that prediction indeed is very readily confirmed. The propaganda model is never taken seriously. It can't be considered. Notice that the propaganda model has a rather disconcerting feature to it. Plainly, as a matter of logic, it's either valid or invalid. If it's invalid, you can dismiss it. If it's valid, you must dismiss it because it's saying the wrong thing. So one way or another, it's got to be dismissed by its very nature. Notice that truth is no defense. It's very much like the traditional doctrine of seditious libel, the doctrine that it's libelous, it's a crime to criticize state authorities because that undermines power. It's a doctrine that runs up to pretty modern times. And truth was never a defense against seditious libel. In fact, truth simply heightened the enormity of the crime of calling authority into disrepute. And the same is true here. Well, of course, the basic questions are factual. Are the standard assumptions correct? That is it true that the press is independent, cantankerous, adversarial, maybe excessively so, or are the assumptions of the propaganda model correct? That's a factual question, and that's the main topic, but I'm barely going to be able to get into it. But before, though I won't try to really, no hope in a few minutes of providing real evidence one way or another. Let me just talk a little bit about the way you would deal with this problem, some methodological questions. First, notice three comments. One, the propaganda model has a certain prior plausibility to it. That is, if you'd simply accept uncontroversial free market assumptions, quite uncontroversial assumptions about how society works, you're led almost automatically to the propaganda model. You can see that pretty simply. Simply ask yourself what the media are. Now, notice here I'm talking about what some might call the agenda-setting media, the media that set the frame that others adapt to. And that's a pretty narrow group. It's primarily the New York Times and the Washington Post and the 3 television channels and a couple of others. It's not much else. Those set the framework that everyone else pretty well adapts to within anything like the mainstream. So we're talking about the agenda-setting media, and ask yourself what they are. Well, what they are is very large corporations. In fact, they're integrated with, often owned by even larger conglomerates. Now, like other businesses, they have a product that they sell to a market. The market is advertisers, other businesses, and the product is audiences. The media don't finance themselves on their audiences. In fact, the audiences are usually a loss. The more you subscribe, the more the newspaper loses money, and of course the television set, you know, they make anything when you turn it on. They make their money from advertisers. Advertising rates go up if you have the right kind of audience. Incidentally, a relatively privileged audience raises advertising rates. So what the media are, just as an institution, is major corporations selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what would you expect to come out of such a system? You'd expect to come out something that reflects the interests of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. That wouldn't be very surprising. In fact, it would be amazing if it weren't true. Quite apart from that, there are many other things pressing in the same direction. There are, after all, centers of power in the society, the state, the corporate sector, others, and they can impose punishments if things go wrong and offer rewards if things go right. You gain by adapting to them. It's less costly, and so on. Furthermore, the top managerial positions in the media, editors and columnists and so on, if you make it into those positions, you're part of the privileged elite, part of the very top, in fact. That's where your associations are, and your perceptions, and your friends, and the people you play golf with, and everything else. And it wouldn't be very surprising, again, if you reflected the same interests. And it goes on. If you think through, we discuss this in our book a lot, but if you think through it, there are just many pressures which lead immediately to the assumption that the propaganda model is highly plausible, even without any evidence. It's got prior plausibility. In fact, it would be rather surprising if it weren't true on uncontroversial assumptions. That's point one. Point two is it has a lot of elite advocacy. That's what I started with, pointing out that it represents a position that intellectual elites have thought the media ought to serve, and the whole system of education and so on ought to serve. That's the position since the 17th century, probably the dominant position. It's necessary to manufacture consent for the general good because of the stupidity of the average man and so on. We have to put aside these democratic dogmatisms. So we have a position that has prior plausibility and elite advocacy. And a third point is it's generally accepted by the public. It's very striking that the debate over the media is determined by the intellectuals. And they're the most indoctrinated sector of the society. And for them, the only debate is over whether the media are too adversarial or not. But there are polls. You ask the public, what do you think about the media? And the public generally thinks the media are too conformist and too subordinate to power. In other words, they automatically accept something like the propaganda model. So here we have three facts: a position that has prior plausibility, elite advocacy, and rather general public support. Well, that doesn't prove that it's valid, of course, but it does suggest that it ought to be part of the discussion. It's not part of the discussion, exactly as the model predicts. Now, by now, turning to the factual matter, there are by now thousands of pages of documentation, detailed, close documentation, on the propaganda model, and it's been tested in just about every conceivable way, subjected to the harshest tests we can think of. I think by now it's one of the best confirmed theses of the social sciences. If there's any serious challenge to it, I've never seen it. It's generally just ignored or else caricatured. So what you have is this very well-confirmed thesis, not proven, very well-confirmed thesis, no serious challenge to it, to my knowledge. It has prior plausibility. The model's plausible on uncontroversial assumptions, advocated by elites, generally supported by the public, but it's not part of the discussion, exactly in accord with its predictions. It's off the agenda. Well, the next task, and the interesting one, would be to look at actual details. As I say, there's plenty of things you can look at in print, indeed, thousands of pages and more coming out, and I'm not going to, I almost hesitate to give examples because they're misleading. Any set of examples will be misleading because I think its predictions are essentially universally confirmed with only statistical error. So giving examples is misleading because you might argue plausibly that the examples are not properly selected. That'd be a reasonable response, and that's why you have to look at a range of tests to make sure they are properly selected, like let the people who think that the media are adversarial pick their own grounds. That's the harshest test that the model can face. So let them pick the grounds. Well, they've picked their grounds, things like the coverage of the Tet Offensive and so on, and it turns out that everything you go to, Tet Offensive, Watergate, Iran-Contra hearings, you take a look at them, they show precisely the subservience of the press to established power. Compare paired historical examples. I mean, history doesn't run controlled experiments, but it runs things that are reasonably close. For example, you can find similar times and similar periods when you can find atrocities of roughly the same scale carried out by official enemies or by ourselves and our clients, and look at the comparative coverage. Or good deeds like elections carried out by our clients and our enemies, and look at the comparative coverage. All of these tests, and in fact every other one we've ever been able to concoct, leads to the same conclusion. The propaganda model is quite valid as a very good first approximation to the way the media function.